When Sandra Bullock fell sick, Keanu Reeves stayed by her side and took care of her. The night was quiet when Sandra felt the first wave of exhaustion hit her body. She had been filming for long hours under the harsh studio lights, and although she kept smiling for everyone on set, her body was giving her small signals that something was wrong. Keanu had noticed it days earlier. He had seen the slight tremble in her hands when she held her coffee, the way her laughter faded faster than usual, and the dull shadow behind her usually bright eyes. But Sandra was someone who never liked to make others worry. She kept pushing forward, believing it was only fatigue, believing rest could wait. That evening, when the cameras finally stopped rolling, Sandra sat alone in her trailer. The mirror in front of her reflected a woman who looked strong to everyone else, but inside she was fighting to stay steady. Her reflection felt like a stranger. Her breath came short, her vision blurred, and within seconds she felt her knees weaken. The cup of tea she was holding slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. The sound startled one of the assistants outside, but it was Keanu who reached her first. He had come to check on her, carrying 2 sandwiches and that calm smile he always carried when he thought someone needed comfort. The moment he saw her on the ground, pale and struggling to speak, the world around him stopped. Without hesitation, he dropped everything and rushed to her side. He lifted her gently, calling her name softly as if his voice alone could bring her back. Sandra tried to speak, but her lips only moved soundlessly. The studio was filled with noise outside, yet inside that small trailer, only Keanu's heartbeat and her shallow breaths filled the air. He called for help immediately, but he didn't leave her side for even a second. His hand stayed over hers, warm and steady, while his other hand brushed her hair away from her face. "You're going to be fine," he whispered quietly, as if convincing both her and himself. His calmness was his strength, but behind his eyes, fear burned quietly. For Keanu, who had already lost people he loved in the past, the thought of losing someone again filled his chest with a silent storm. When the medical team arrived, they found Sandra semi-conscious. They said it could be exhaustion and dehydration mixed with stress, but Keanu refused to let her stay alone at the hospital. He followed the ambulance in his own car, driving through the quiet streets with headlights reflecting on his face. Every red light felt like an eternity. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his thoughts racing between memories of laughter, old interviews, and moments when she had taken care of him years ago. Life had a strange way of circling back, and now it was his turn to be the one who stayed. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and silence. Machines beeped steadily, nurses moved with practiced calm, and Keanu stood in the hallway still wearing his film costume, unaware of how disheveled he looked. He waited for hours until the doctor finally came out, assuring him that she was stable but needed rest and close observation. Keanu nodded, but his eyes never left the door of her room. He entered quietly when the doctor allowed it. The soft light from the monitor painted her face in pale blue, and seeing her like that hit him harder than any scene they had ever filmed together. He pulled the chair close and sat beside her, his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on her sleeping face. He remembered the day they met, years ago, when both were young and shy, unsure of how much their lives would intertwine through films, laughter, and unspoken understanding. She had once told him that kindness was her favorite language, and he had never forgotten that. Tonight, he spoke that language without words. He stayed there through the night, adjusting her blanket, making sure the nurses didn't miss a thing, and refusing to go home even when they told him she was fine. When Sandra opened her eyes in the middle of the night, she saw him dozing in the chair beside her. His head was slightly tilted forward, his hand still resting near hers, as if even in sleep he was making sure she wouldn't feel alone. Her voice was weak when she said his name. Keanu woke instantly. His first smile that night was soft and tired but filled with relief. "You scared me," he said gently. Sandra tried to apologize, but he shook his head. "Don't. Just rest." Tears filled her eyes. It wasn't because of the pain or the weakness. It was because of the way he looked at her, not as a superstar, not as a friend, but as someone who truly cared. She had seen kindness before, but this was something different. It was quiet, steady, and selfless. It reminded her of why she had always admired him. He asked if she needed anything, and when she said she felt thirsty, he went to pour water himself instead of calling a nurse. He even held the cup to her lips carefully, making sure she didn't spill. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. Every move he made that night carried the weight of affection and sincerity. Hours passed slowly. Outside, dawn began to rise, painting the window in shades of gold. Sandra watched it silently, and Keanu sat beside her, lost in thought. They didn't speak much, but sometimes silence tells stories that words cannot. As the city woke up, Keanu looked at her and said quietly, "You've spent your life taking care of everyone else. It's okay to let someone take care of you now." Those words sank deep into her heart. No one had ever said that to her before, not like that. For the next few days, Keanu rearranged his schedule to stay with her. He brought food from her favorite places, talked to the doctors himself, and kept fans and press away with gentle but firm words. The media had already started guessing things, spinning stories, but he didn't care. All he cared about was making sure she had peace to heal. Sometimes he read to her from the book she kept on her bedside. Sometimes he simply sat in silence while she slept. When she smiled, he smiled back. When she grew weak again, he held her hand tighter. And yet, under that calm surface, something deeper was happening. Sandra began to realize how much his presence meant to her, and Keanu began to see how fragile life could be when someone you care for falls silent. He had always lived quietly, believing in doing good without needing to be seen. Now, sitting in that small hospital room, he felt a strange warmth returning to his heart, something he hadn't felt in years. One evening, when Sandra was finally well enough to talk, she asked him why he stayed. He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because you would have done the same for me," he said softly. She wanted to say something more, something about how his presence had changed how she saw love, friendship, and strength, but her throat tightened. Instead, she smiled weakly and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded and smiled, but there was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite read. As the days passed, they both began to sense that what they were feeling went beyond friendship, yet neither dared to say it aloud. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was timing, or maybe it was the quiet understanding that some emotions are too sacred to rush. But fate, as always, had its own plans. On the evening before she was discharged, the doctor mentioned something unexpected. The tests had shown something unusual, something they needed to check again. Sandra's heart sank as she looked at Keanu, and for the first time, fear returned to her eyes. Keanu didn't move. His calm expression didn't hide the storm brewing behind it. The doctor asked her to stay for one more round of tests. Sandra nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the bedsheet. Keanu reached out and placed his hand over hers once more, steady and warm. "Whatever it is," he said quietly, "we'll face it together." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears she couldn't hold back. She believed him. But deep inside, both of them knew that what came next could change everything. The nurse came in and closed the door gently, leaving the two of them alone again. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance as rain began to fall. The soft tapping on the window filled the silence. Keanu stood up, walked toward the window, and stared at the city lights blurred by the storm. Sandra watched him, realizing that his quiet presence was the calm she had always searched for. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone anymore. The rain kept falling and the night deepened. Sandra closed her eyes, whispering a small prayer for strength. Keanu turned back toward her, watching her drift to sleep, unaware that the results waiting in the doctor's hands would soon reveal a truth neither of them was prepared to face. When Sandra Bullock fell sick, Keanu Reeves stayed by her side and took care of her. Morning light crept slowly into the hospital room, soft and silent. Sandra woke to the faint hum of machines and the rhythmic sound of rain fading outside. Keanu was still there, sitting on the same chair beside her bed, his head resting on his hand, eyes half closed but alert. He had not gone home even once since she was admitted. His clothes were the same, slightly wrinkled, but his calm presence filled the space with quiet warmth. Sandra smiled faintly, though fear lingered behind her tired eyes. Today was the day the doctor promised to share the full test results. As the clock ticked, Sandra's heart grew heavier. She had always been brave in front of cameras, always strong for others, but now in the stillness of this small room, she felt fragile. She watched Keanu walk toward the small hospital window and adjust the blinds, letting a sliver of sunlight brighten the room. "You should eat something," he said softly, turning toward her with that gentle expression that never demanded, only offered. She nodded, though she had no appetite. The door opened quietly and the doctor stepped in, holding a clipboard. His smile was polite, but Sandra noticed the subtle hesitation in his voice when he greeted them. Keanu stood up instantly, his posture straight, his face calm but serious. "Good morning," he said. The doctor nodded, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Miss Bullock, your condition is mostly stable now. However, one of your recent scans showed something we didn't expect." We'd like to run a few more tests to be certain. Sandra's chest tightened. Something? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. The doctor looked at her kindly but avoided giving full detail yet. It could be nothing serious, he said, but it's best we check thoroughly. Keanu stepped closer to her bed and placed his hand gently over hers. His touch felt grounding. What kind of tests? He asked. The doctor explained they needed to perform imaging and some blood work to rule out any complications related to exhaustion or possible infection. It was all technical, but Sandra only caught pieces of it. All she felt was the cold wave of uncertainty washing through her. When the doctor left, the silence returned, heavier than before. Sandra turned her face toward the window, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm scared," she whispered, barely audible. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He sat down again, leaned forward, and spoke softly. "It's okay to be scared. Being scared means you still have something to fight for." She looked at him, her lips trembling. "What if it's something serious?" He met her eyes and said, "Then we'll face it one day at a time." The way he said "we" made her heart tremble. It wasn't just comfort, it was a quiet promise. A few hours later, nurses came to take her for the new tests. Keanu followed her through the hallways, his steps steady behind the stretcher. Even when the staff told him to wait outside, he stayed by the door, his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the red light above the testing room. Time moved differently for him in that hallway, every minute stretched into eternity. When the test was done, Sandra returned pale and tired. Keanu helped her back to her bed, adjusted her blanket, and made sure she was comfortable. She tried to smile, but the fear never left her face. To distract her, Keanu began telling her stories, not about Hollywood, not about fame, but small, personal stories. About his childhood in Toronto, about his first motorcycle, about how he used to sit on rooftops to watch the stars when he couldn't sleep. His voice had a rhythm that soothed her. She listened quietly, letting his words fill the silence between them. She realized he rarely talked about himself, but now he was opening little doors to his soul just to keep her from drowning in worry. Later that evening, the doctor returned. This time, his expression was more serious. Sandra's pulse quickened. Keanu stood again, his jaw tight, eyes unreadable. The doctor spoke carefully. "There's inflammation in your lungs," he said. "It's likely pneumonia, possibly developed from fatigue and dehydration. You'll need rest, medication, and time to recover. If untreated earlier, it could have become severe." Sandra exhaled, relief mixed with fear. Pneumonia sounded serious, but it wasn't as terrifying as what her mind had imagined. Still, the word echoed in her chest. Keanu stepped closer, his hand returning to hers. "So she'll recover fully?" he asked. The doctor nodded. "Yes, but only if she rests. No work, no stress." When the doctor left, Sandra let out a long sigh. Keanu smiled softly. "See, nothing we can't handle," he said. She laughed weakly. "We," she repeated. "You've already taken this too seriously, haven't you?" He shrugged lightly, a small grin touching his lips. "Too late. I'm already invested." Her laugh turned into a small cough, and instantly Keanu grabbed the glass of water and held it for her again. Every small action he did carried quiet devotion, not showy, not dramatic, but deeply human. That night when she fell asleep, Keanu stepped outside for the first time in 2 days. He walked down the quiet hospital corridor and leaned against the wall, letting his exhaustion catch up with him. His phone buzzed, messages from his agent, missed calls from producers, but he ignored them all. His world right now existed in that single room where Sandra slept peacefully. As the night grew deeper, he looked up at the ceiling and whispered to himself, "Please let her heal." The next few days were slow but steady. Sandra began responding well to the treatment. Her color returned, her voice grew stronger, and her laughter came back. The nurses noticed how Keanu treated her not as a patient, but as someone precious. He brought flowers, arranged her pillows, and even read movie scripts out loud when she was bored. Sometimes she'd tease him for reading too seriously, and he'd smile in that quiet, self-conscious way he always did. One afternoon, she told him, "You should rest too, Keanu. You look tired." He smiled faintly. "I rest when you rest." "You don't have to do all this," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why it matters." Those words stayed in her heart long after. By the 5th day, the doctor said she could leave soon if she continued to improve. Sandra smiled with relief, but there was something else she didn't say. When she was asleep the night before, she had overheard 2 nurses whispering outside about how close she had come to a severe infection. If Keanu hadn't acted quickly that first night, things might have turned much worse. The thought shook her deeply. She realized how easily life could change in a single moment and how fragile everything truly was. That evening she told him, "You saved me." He looked up from the chair where he was sitting and said quietly, "No, you saved yourself. I just stayed beside you." "That's the hardest part," she whispered. "Staying?" He didn't reply, but his eyes softened. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in orange and pink, Sandra felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't sure what this feeling was, gratitude, affection, or something deeper, but it filled her completely. Keanu turned toward the window, his silhouette bathed in the fading light. "When you leave this hospital," he said softly, "promise me one thing." "What?" she asked. "Take time for yourself, don't rush back to everything. The world can wait." She nodded slowly, her throat tightening with emotion. "And what about you?" she asked quietly. He smiled faintly. "I'll be around, just not where cameras can see." For a moment they both smiled, the kind of smile that holds unspoken understanding. But just as peace began to settle, the nurse entered with an envelope. "Miss Bullock, these are your final reports. The doctor asked you to review them tomorrow before discharge." Sandra took the envelope and placed it on the table beside her. Her hands trembled slightly, but she tried not to show it. Keanu noticed, his eyes lingering on the sealed paper. Something in him stirred, a strange unease he couldn't explain. That night, long after Sandra had fallen asleep, he quietly picked up the envelope and looked at it under the dim light. He didn't open it, but something about it felt heavier than paper. He placed it back gently, his thoughts restless. As he looked at her sleeping peacefully, a sudden thought crossed his mind. What if tomorrow brought news they weren't ready for? Outside, thunder rolled again in the distance, echoing faintly through the glass. Keanu sat back in the chair, his hand covering his face. He closed his eyes and whispered softly to the dark, "Please, just let her be okay." The night deepened. Sandra turned in her sleep, murmuring his name softly. Keanu looked up, his eyes full of unspoken emotion. He leaned closer, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and whispered, "I'm right here." But in the quiet of that hospital room, neither of them knew that the next morning would bring a discovery that would test both their strength and their hearts in ways they had never imagined. When Sandra Bullock fell sick, Keanu Reeves stayed by her side and took care of her. Morning came with a quiet chill. Sunlight filtered softly through the white curtains, casting gentle lines across the room. Sandra slowly opened her eyes, still feeling weak but lighter than the day before. Keanu was already awake, sitting in the same chair as always, holding a paper cup of coffee and staring out the window. There was peace in his stillness, but also a faint shadow beneath his calm. He turned when she stirred, his voice warm but tired. "Morning," he said. She smiled faintly. "You're here early again," he smiled back. "I never left." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hospital air was quiet except for the faint hum of machines. Then Sandra's eyes shifted toward the envelope on the small table beside her bed, the one containing her final reports. She had ignored it last night. She wasn't ready then, and part of her still wasn't, but she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. The nurse entered with breakfast and a kind smile. "Good morning, Miss Bullock. Doctor will be here shortly to go through the results." Sandra nodded, her throat tightening. Keanu noticed her hand tremble slightly as she reached for the glass of water. Without a word, he took it and held it for her like he always did. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the fear in her heart softened. After the nurse left, Keanu sat down again, leaning forward with his hands clasped together. "You want me to be here when they tell you?" he asked quietly. She looked at him, eyes glistening. "Yes, please don't go." His voice was gentle. "I won't." A few minutes later, the doctor entered. He looked calm, professional, but his tone carried a careful weight. He greeted them both and sat across from Sandra. "Your pneumonia is improving well," he began. "Your lungs are healing faster than expected." Sandra smiled with relief, but she noticed the doctor wasn't finished. He cleared his throat and continued. "However, while reviewing your scans, we noticed something else, a small mass in your right lung. It's too early to say what it is, but it needs further analysis." The words dropped like stones into silence. Sandra's smile froze. Keanu's expression didn't change at first. His eyes stayed fixed on the doctor, his breathing steady but deep. "What do you mean, a mass?" he asked. The doctor explained gently. "It could be benign, many are, but we recommend a biopsy to be sure." The word biopsy echoed in the air like a whisper of thunder. Sandra's fingers gripped the edge of her blanket. She tried to stay composed, but her vision blurred for a second. Keanu reached out instantly, placing his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. After the doctor left, the silence stretched painfully long. Sandra stared at the window, her voice barely a whisper. "A mass," she repeated. "That sounds like cancer, doesn't it?" Keanu shook his head. "We don't know yet. Don't think that way. But what if, don't, he said softly but firmly, don't torture yourself with what ifs. She turned toward him, tears filling her eyes. Keanu, I'm scared. His gaze softened. Then let me be scared with you. The simplicity of his words broke something inside her. She covered her face with her hands, and for the first time in years, she cried without pretending to be strong. Keanu didn't speak. He simply moved closer, wrapping his arms around her shoulders and holding her quietly while she cried into his chest. There was no grand gesture, no empty promise, only the steady rhythm of his breathing against her ear, telling her she wasn't alone. Later that day, Sandra's agent called, asking when she would return to filming. Keanu answered the phone instead, his tone calm but cold. She won't be back until she's fully recovered, he said, and ended the call before the agent could argue. When Sandra tried to protest, he turned to her gently. You've spent years giving every piece of yourself to others. Now it's time to give something to yourself, time, rest, care. She looked at him for a long time. Why do you care so much? She asked softly. He smiled faintly. Because you cared when I didn't think anyone could. Memories flooded her mind. Years ago, when he had lost people he loved, she had been the one who checked on him quietly without asking for anything in return. She had brought food, written small notes, reminded him to keep living when his heart had gone numb. She realized now that kindness always finds its way back. In the evening, the nurse returned to schedule the biopsy for the next morning. Sandra nodded weakly, her mind spinning with fears she couldn't name. When the nurse left, she looked at Keanu. What if it's bad news tomorrow? He looked back at her steadily. Then we face it, and if it's good, we celebrate. Either way, we'll be together. She tried to smile, but tears filled her eyes again. She whispered, You really mean that? Every word, he said quietly. That night, Keanu stayed even after visiting hours. When the nurses asked him to leave, he politely refused and moved to the corner chair. One nurse smiled knowingly and said, You must care about her a lot. Keanu's eyes softened. More than she knows. As midnight passed, Sandra lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The hospital lights were dim, and Keanu sat near her, reading a book he had brought from her home. His presence calmed her. She listened to the turning pages, the faint rain outside, and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Finally, she spoke softly. Keanu, he looked up. Yeah, if something happens, promise you'll still go on. Promise me you'll live your life. He closed the book, stood, and walked to her bedside. Nothing's going to happen, he said. Promise me anyway, she whispered. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. Okay. I promise. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. Thank you. Sleep, he said gently. Tomorrow will be a new day. But Keanu didn't sleep that night. He sat there in silence, his eyes fixed on the floor, his mind heavy with memories of his sister's illness, of hospital rooms that had once felt just like this one, of promises he couldn't keep in the past. He whispered to himself, not again, not her. The next morning, the biopsy was performed. Sandra squeezed Keanu's hand tightly as the nurse prepared the equipment. He leaned close and whispered, breathe. You're stronger than this. She nodded, fighting back tears. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. Thank you. Sleep, he said gently. Tomorrow will be a new day. But Keanu didn't sleep that night. He sat there in silence, his eyes fixed on the floor, his mind heavy with memories of his sister's illness, of hospital rooms that had once felt just like this one, of promises he couldn't keep in the past. He whispered to himself, not again, not her. The next morning, the biopsy was performed. Sandra squeezed Keanu's hand tightly as the nurse prepared the equipment. He leaned close and whispered, breathe. You're stronger than this? She nodded, fighting back tears. After it was done, she was taken back to her room to rest. Keanu stayed at her side, brushing her hair away gently, watching her sleep. The hours that followed felt endless. By evening, the doctor returned, holding the report in his hands. Keanu stood up immediately, his chest tight. Sandra woke slowly, sensing the tension. The doctor took a deep breath before speaking. The mass is small and appears non-malignant for now. It's likely scar tissue from an old infection. We'll monitor it closely, but there's no sign of cancer. Sandra froze for a moment, then covered her face as tears of relief poured down. Keanu exhaled deeply, his shoulders dropping as if the weight of the world had finally lifted. He smiled faintly, his eyes moist. You're okay, he said softly. You're really okay. Sandra reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. Thank you for not letting me fall apart. He shook his head. You never would have. You're stronger than you think. But as relief filled the room, Sandra noticed something strange in his eyes, a quiet sadness hidden beneath the calm. She didn't mention it, but it stayed with her. Later that night, when she finally fell asleep, Keanu stepped outside to the hospital garden. He looked up at the night sky, whispering something only the wind could hear. A nurse passing by noticed him and said softly, "She's lucky to have you." He smiled faintly, eyes still on the stars. "No," he said quietly, "I'm the lucky one." He didn't know then that while Sandra's storm was finally clearing, another was slowly building, one that would test his own strength and reveal a truth he had been hiding from her all along. When Sandra Bullock fell sick, Keanu Reeves stayed by her side and took care of her. The hospital room felt lighter the next morning. Sunlight poured in through the windows, painting the white walls in gold. Birds could be heard faintly outside, and for the first time in many days, Sandra woke with peace instead of fear. Her body still felt weak, but her heart felt stronger. The test results had brought relief like a breath after drowning, and she was ready to leave the hospital behind. Keanu walked in with a quiet smile, carrying a small paper bag and 2 cups of coffee. "They finally said you can go home today," he said softly. Sandra smiled, her voice still gentle. "That sounds like the most beautiful sentence I've heard in weeks." He placed the coffee beside her bed and handed her a small flower from the garden outside, a white lily, simple and bright. "This one reminded me of you," he said quietly. She took it carefully, smiling at how thoughtful he always was. Within an hour, she was ready to leave. The nurses waved her goodbye and the doctor reminded her to rest. Keanu handled the paperwork, never letting her lift a finger. As they stepped out into the open air, Sandra took a deep breath. It felt like freedom. She turned to him and said softly, "You've done too much already. I can manage now." He looked at her for a moment, his voice calm. "Then let me help just a little longer." They drove through the quiet streets of Los Angeles, the city shining under a clear sky. The world outside moved as if nothing had changed, but inside, Sandra felt everything had. The near loss had reshaped how she saw her life and how she saw him. She turned to glance at Keanu, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes focused on the road. His silence carried a kind of peace she hadn't known she needed. Back at her home, Keanu helped her settle in. He made soup himself, something simple and warm. Sandra watched him move around her kitchen with ease, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back. It was strange seeing him there, not the actor, not the public figure, just the man who cared deeply, quietly, and without expecting anything in return. As she ate, she said softly, "You've always been kind, even when no one's watching." He smiled faintly. "That's the only time kindness means something." The next few days were slow and gentle. Sandra rested while Keanu took care of small things, groceries, calls, even walking her dog. But every now and then, she noticed something odd. Sometimes when he stood up too quickly, he winced. Sometimes he pressed his hand to his side when he thought she wasn't looking. When she asked if he was okay, he always smiled and said, "Just tired." She didn't believe him. One evening, as the sun began to set and painted her living room in shades of orange and gold, she decided to ask him directly. "Keanu, are you sure you're fine?" she asked softly. "You look pale." He paused for a moment, then gave a small smile. "I'm fine, really. I think I just need sleep." "You've been saying that for days," she said gently. "But I can see it. You're hiding something." He looked away, eyes distant. "It's nothing serious." "Then why won't you tell me?" she pressed. He sighed, sitting down beside her. "Because you've just been through enough. I didn't want to add to it." She reached for his hand. "Please, if something's wrong, I need to know." For a long moment he stayed silent. Then finally he spoke. "I've been feeling weak lately. Headaches, fatigue. I thought it was nothing, but it's been getting worse." Her heart sank. "Did you see a doctor?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "A few weeks ago, before you got sick." "And," she whispered. He looked at her with calm eyes that carried a quiet sadness. "They said it might be an immune issue. Something manageable, but it needs treatment. I didn't tell anyone, not even my team." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "You've been taking care of me while you were sick yourself." He gave a small shrug. "It helped me forget about it." The words hit her harder than she expected. All those nights he had stayed awake for her, all the hours he spent watching over her, he had been silently fighting his own battle. She couldn't stop the tears that fell. He reached up and brushed one from her cheek gently. "Hey," he whispered, "don't cry, I'm fine." She shook her head. "No, you're not. You can't hide pain behind kindness forever." He smiled sadly. "It's easier that way." That night, she insisted on driving him to the clinic for a full checkup. He resisted at first, but one look from her, firm and caring, and he gave in. At the clinic, while they waited for his tests, Sandra held his hand the way he had held hers days ago. Roles had reversed, but the bond between them had only deepened. When the doctor finally came out, he spoke gently. "His condition isn't critical, but his immune system is weak." Stress and exhaustion are making it worse. He needs rest, medication, and to avoid overworking. Sandra sighed in relief but couldn't hide her concern. On the drive home, she was quiet. Keanu glanced at her. "You're angry with me," he said softly. "No," she said. "I'm just sad. You always take care of everyone else. When will you let someone take care of you?" He chuckled quietly. "Maybe now." The next morning, she showed up at his house with a basket of food, herbal tea, and that same lily he had once given her. "If you won't rest at your place," she said, "I'll stay here and make sure you do." He looked at her, surprised. "Sandra, you don't have to," she interrupted him gently. "Yes, I do." For the first time in years, he let someone in. She cooked for him, cleaned his kitchen, and made sure he took his medicine on time. Sometimes they sat on his porch at night, talking about life, fame, and the meaning of peace. There was no glamour there, no spotlight, only two souls who had found comfort in each other's quiet presence. One evening, as they sat under a fading sky, Sandra looked at him and said softly, "You once said it's okay to let someone take care of you. Let me do that now." He looked at her, his voice low. "You already are." As the days passed, their bond deepened into something neither dared to name. It wasn't about romance yet. It was about something purer, trust, compassion, and shared healing. But deep inside, both of them felt something growing. Every touch, every look, every word carried a quiet electricity. Then one night, as Sandra prepared dinner in his kitchen, Keanu received a call. He stepped outside to answer it, his tone low and serious. When he returned, his face had changed, calm, but with a heaviness behind his eyes. Sandra noticed instantly. "Who was that?" she asked. He hesitated, then said softly, "My doctor. They found something new in the tests. They want to run more scans tomorrow." The silence that followed was thick and painful. Sandra's heart raced, memories of her own hospital nights flooding back. "Keanu," she whispered, "please tell me it's not serious." He looked at her gently, his voice steady but heavy. "I don't know yet." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Then whatever it is, you won't face it alone. Do you understand me?" He smiled faintly. "I understand." As he turned away toward the window, the city lights reflected in his eyes. Sandra stood there, watching him, realizing that life had quietly reversed their paths. She had been the one in the hospital bed weeks ago, and now it was her turn to stay, to fight, to be the one who wouldn't leave. The next day's sunrise felt heavy. Keanu didn't show it, but Sandra could see the fear he tried to hide behind his calmness. When he finally whispered, "I'm not afraid of being sick, I'm afraid of making you worry again," Sandra reached out, took his hand, and said softly, "Then let's worry together." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of rain, the same sound that had once comforted them in the hospital. And as they stood in silence, holding hands, the world seemed to slow again, waiting for what tomorrow would reveal. When Sandra Bullock fell sick, Keanu Reeves stayed by her side and took care of her. The next morning came quietly, but the air inside Keanu's house felt heavy. Sunlight spilled through the wide glass windows, soft and warm, yet there was a silence that neither of them dared to break. Sandra sat at the kitchen table, stirring her tea slowly, watching Keanu from across the room. He looked calm, as always, that same gentle face, the same soft-spoken peace. But his eyes told another story. There was fear hiding there, a quiet kind of fear that only someone who had lived through loss could recognize. "You didn't sleep much," she said softly. Keanu smiled faintly. "I never do." "Is it because of the test?" He looked down, avoiding her eyes. "Maybe I just don't like waiting." Sandra reached out, placing her hand over his. "You waited for me, remember? I'll wait for you now. We'll face this together." His fingers curled slightly under hers, holding on for a moment longer than he meant to. "I know," he whispered. "That's why I'm not as scared as I should be." The hours crawled by until the clinic called. They asked him to come in that afternoon to discuss the results. Sandra insisted on going with him. He tried to refuse, but she wouldn't listen. "You didn't leave me alone, and I won't leave you," she said firmly. He gave a small smile, the kind that spoke gratitude without words. At the clinic, the same doctor greeted them with a serious expression. He asked Keanu to sit. Sandra stayed beside him, her hand resting quietly on his arm. The doctor opened the file, his voice gentle but precise. "We found irregularities in your blood results. It appears your immune condition is more advanced than we thought. It's called chronic autoimmune fatigue syndrome, and it's beginning to affect your internal organs." The room fell silent. Keanu blinked slowly, absorbing the words. "Is it treatable?" he asked calmly. "Manageable," the doctor replied. "But only with strict rest, regular treatment, and less stress. If ignored, it could lead to serious complications." Sandra felt the world tilt. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked, her voice barely steady. The doctor looked at her kindly. "It means he'll have good days and bad days, but he can still live a full life as long as he takes care of himself." Keanu nodded slowly, as if already accepting it. "Thank you," he said quietly. When they stepped outside, Sandra turned to him, her heart breaking at the calmness in his face. "Why didn't you tell me before it got this bad?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes soft. "Because I didn't want pity, and because I thought if I just kept moving, it would go away." "You can't fight something like this alone," she whispered. "I'm not alone anymore," he said quietly, his gaze meeting hers. On the drive home, neither of them spoke. The sky outside had turned gray, clouds gathering above the hills. It felt like the world had paused with them, holding its breath. Sandra's hands were tight on the steering wheel, and every few minutes she glanced at him. He sat quietly, staring out the window, lost in thought. When they reached his house, he thanked her for driving. She followed him inside and made tea while he sat on the couch, silent. Finally, she said softly, "You always carried everyone's pain, didn't you?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe it's easier than facing my own." She set the tea down and sat beside him. "You don't have to do that anymore," she said. "Let me carry some of it for you." He turned toward her, eyes glistening faintly. "You've already done that," he whispered, "just by being here." That evening, the rain started again, soft at first, then heavier. Sandra cooked him dinner and made sure he ate. He protested, laughing quietly, but she stayed firm. "Don't make me scold you like a child," she said, pretending to sound stern. He smiled for real this time, that rare, genuine smile that made her heart ache. "You'd make a good doctor," he said. "Only for you," she answered softly, and for a moment their eyes locked longer than before. Later that night, as he grew tired, she helped him to bed. He looked at her, surprised. "You don't have to stay." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Go to sleep." He hesitated, then nodded, his voice quiet. "It's strange," he murmured. "For the first time in a long time, I feel safe." She sat beside him until he fell asleep, watching his breathing steady, his face soft in the dim light. She thought about all the years she had known him, the laughter, the quiet talks, the shared silences. He had always been the calm in every storm, the man who carried peace wherever he went. And now, she realized, it was her turn to be that peace for him. The next morning, she woke early and made breakfast. When Keanu came out of his room, she was already in the kitchen, humming softly. He watched her for a moment, leaning against the doorframe. "You're really taking this doctor thing seriously," he said with a sleepy smile. "You bet I am," she replied. "Breakfast, medicine, rest, repeat. That's your new life schedule." He laughed quietly. "Yes, ma'am." As days turned into weeks, they fell into a rhythm: quiet mornings, simple meals, soft evenings. Sandra stayed close, helping him rest, taking him for walks, reading with him. They rarely spoke about the illness. Instead, they talked about dreams, about life, about everything they had never said before. But one evening, as they sat watching the sunset from his porch, Keanu broke the silence. "You know, this might sound strange," he said softly, "but I think getting sick showed me something." "What?" she asked gently. "How lucky I am to still be here, and how lucky I am that you didn't give up on me." Her eyes softened. "I could never give up on you." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment it felt like the world around them disappeared. The air was quiet, the light golden, and their eyes held all the things they hadn't said. But before either could speak, Keanu's phone buzzed. It was his manager, reminding him of an upcoming charity event in 2 days. He sighed, setting the phone down. "I should go. I promised months ago." Sandra frowned. "You just started getting better. You shouldn't push yourself." "It's important," he said softly. "It's for children in hospitals. I can't cancel." She hesitated, then nodded. "Then I'm going with you." He looked at her, surprised, then smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." The night of the event arrived quickly. Cameras flashed, reporters gathered, and the red carpet gleamed under the lights. Keanu looked elegant in his dark suit, but Sandra noticed the faint tiredness behind his smile. She stayed close to him, her hand resting gently on his arm. When they stepped into the hall, applause filled the air. Halfway through the evening, as Keanu spoke on stage about kindness and healing, his voice wavered. He gripped the podium, steadying himself, his face pale. Sandra's heart stopped. Within seconds, he stumbled slightly. People gasped. She rushed forward just as he lost balance. By the time she reached him, he was breathing hard, his eyes closed for a moment. The crowd went silent. Sandra knelt beside him, her hand on his cheek. "Keanu, can you hear me?" she whispered. He opened his eyes slowly, forcing a small smile. "I'm okay," he murmured weakly. "Just dizzy." But she saw it, the pain in his face, the trembling in his hands. Paramedics came quickly, guiding him backstage. Sandra stayed by his side, holding his hand tightly. The same scene replayed from weeks ago, but this time their roles had completely changed. When they reached the hospital, the doctor examined him carefully. Sandra waited outside, pacing endlessly, her heart pounding. After what felt like hours, the doctor came out. "He'll be okay," the doctor said. It was exhaustion and low blood pressure, likely from overexertion. But he needs to slow down, really slow down, or next time it could be worse. Sandra pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling silently. When she was finally allowed in, she found him resting, pale but smiling weakly. "I told you I'd be okay," he said softly. She sat beside him, taking his hand. "You scared me," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Now you know how I felt." She laughed through her tears, leaning her forehead against his hand. "No more events, no more overworking. From now on, we live slowly, together." Keanu looked at her, his eyes filled with quiet warmth. "Together," he repeated. As the night deepened outside, they sat in silence, holding hands. For the first time in years, both of them felt something real, not the glamour of fame, not the noise of the world, but the simple truth of love born from kindness, loyalty, and shared strength. And though neither said the words aloud, both knew it now, this wasn't just friendship anymore. It was something deeper, something that had quietly grown in the space between pain and healing. But just when peace finally seemed to return, the doctor walked in again, holding a small report in his hand, his expression unreadable. "Miss Bullock," he said softly, "there's something else you should know." Sandra froze. Keanu opened his eyes slowly, watching her face pale. Whatever the doctor was about to say, they both knew it would change everything again. When Sandra Bullock fell sick, Keanu Reeves stayed by her side and took care of her. The room fell silent after the doctor's words. Sandra looked at him, her heart thudding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Keanu was lying back on the bed, pale but calm, his eyes slowly drifting from the doctor to her. The faint hum of machines filled the space between them, and time seemed to pause. The doctor cleared his throat softly. "The results from Keanu's recent scans showed something we didn't expect," he said gently. "There's inflammation near his heart, likely caused by his autoimmune condition. It's early and we can manage it, but he needs absolute rest. No stress, no pressure. His body's been through too much." Sandra's breath caught. "Inflammation. Near his heart?" The doctor nodded. "It's not life-threatening right now, but if he continues pushing himself, it could become serious." Keanu stayed quiet, his face unreadable. Sandra turned to him, tears already pooling in her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me you were feeling this bad?" she whispered. He gave a small smile, one of those gentle ones that always tried to calm others even when he was the one in pain. "I didn't know it was this bad," he said softly. "And I didn't want to worry you." Sandra stood up, shaking her head. "You were collapsing on stage, Keanu. You scared everyone. You scared me." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly. "Come here," he said quietly. She moved closer, sitting beside him. He took her hand and pressed it to his chest, where his heartbeat thudded faintly beneath his hospital gown. "See," he whispered. "It's still strong. I'll be okay." Her voice broke. "You said that before. And you kept going until you fell." He smiled again, weak but full of warmth. "Maybe I just needed someone to stop me." She let out a small laugh through her tears. "Then I'm not letting you out of my sight." "I was hoping you'd say that," he murmured, his eyes closing briefly. The doctor left quietly, giving them space. Sandra stayed beside him, her hand never leaving his. For a long while, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of everything they had survived, everything they had lost, and everything they still hoped for. As the evening light dimmed, Keanu whispered, "You know what's strange?" "What?" she asked. "I used to think strength was about holding on alone. Now I realize it's about knowing who to hold on to." She smiled softly, tears shining in her eyes. "And who are you holding on to now?" He turned his head slightly, looking at her. "You," those simple words hit her like a wave. She couldn't speak for a moment. She just held his hand tighter and leaned closer, resting her forehead gently against his. "Then you're not going anywhere," she whispered. "Not this time." Over the next few days, Keanu stayed in the hospital under observation. Sandra never left his side. She brought books, music, and even small drawings from children who admired him. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they sat in silence, and sometimes she caught him watching her with a softness that said more than any words could. On the fourth morning, the doctor finally smiled. "His heart is stabilizing," he said. "He's responding well to the treatment." Sandra let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She turned to Keanu, who smiled faintly. "See," he whispered. "Told you I'd be okay." She rolled her eyes playfully. Don't get cocky, you're still under my care. He laughed, that quiet, genuine laugh that made everything lighter. Yes, doctor. When he was discharged a few days later, Sandra took him home. This time it was her turn to cook, to fuss, to make sure he took his medicine. And every time he teased her for being overprotective, she'd say, "You earned it." As weeks turned into months, they both healed not just their bodies but their hearts. Keanu began spending more time away from the noise of fame, focusing on peace, on stillness, on the quiet things that made life beautiful. Sandra did the same. Sometimes they would walk together in the park, holding coffee cups, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes they would just sit side by side, watching sunsets in silence. One evening, months after the hospital, they sat by the lake near Keanu's home. The sky was painted in soft pink and gold. The air was still. Sandra leaned back against the wooden bench, watching the reflection of the clouds on the water. "Funny how life can change in one heartbeat," she said softly. Keanu nodded. "It teaches you what matters." "And what matters to you now?" she asked, turning to him. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Peace, kindness, and the people who never left." She smiled, eyes glistening. "Then I guess we found the same thing." He reached out and took her hand gently. "We always were looking in the same direction," he said quietly. For a moment, neither spoke. They just sat there, hands intertwined, the last rays of sunlight touching their faces. In that stillness, there was no fame, no noise, no fear, just two souls who had walked through pain and found healing in each other's presence. After a while, Sandra said softly, "You know, when I was lying in that hospital bed, I thought it was the end of something, but it wasn't. It was the beginning." Keanu smiled faintly. "The beginning of what?" "The beginning of learning what real love looks like." He turned to her, his voice quiet. "And what does it look like?" She smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. "It looks like this, staying. No matter what." Keanu's eyes softened. "Then I guess we both found it." They stayed there until the stars began to appear, the night calm and endless. The world around them had changed, and yet it felt finally right. Later, as they walked back to the car, Sandra looked at him and said, "Promise me something." "Anything," he said. "No more pushing yourself until you break, no more hiding pain. We face everything together from now on." He smiled softly, squeezing her hand. "Together," he whispered again. And in that single word, a lifetime of promises lived, of care, of respect, of love born not from romance, but from something purer and stronger. Two hearts that had carried each other through fear and found peace in kindness. As the car drove away and disappeared into the quiet night, the world around them seemed softer somehow, as if even the universe paused for a moment to honor what they had built. Not a story of fame or tragedy, but one of resilience, faith, and love that refused to fade. And in that silence, their story found its ending, not with grand gestures, but with two hands that never let go.